Good morning, everybody. So what I want to do today is essentially kind of open a discussion about the nature of environment, the nature of the problem of the environment, what I call the big problem fallacy. Where does and how do we relate to the nature of nature itself? How does that relate to a bigger cosmology of thinking about education and its interpolation with culture? What role, if any, does Islam have in this? So what I want to do is kind of break up the presentation into a couple of parts. So hopefully it'll give us the opportunity to think about your own papers, to think about questions related to the bigger picture things. And so that's essentially what the keynote is about, is thinking about big picture elements. So perhaps to begin with, the pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophon famously observed that if animals such as horses or lions could draw their gods, they would create them in their own image. Namely, to create is an act of reacting to the world, and what we place as superordinate visions of reality through the creation of deities can become also part of us. This, following Xenophon, is the plight of the idol maker. The idol, the word that we get from ideolum, from Latin, or image, perceives not anything but its maker. We, human beings, are often called homo phobia, which is the making animal. We are wont to turn the creative eye inward oftentimes, not to some greater reality, but oftentimes when we make, does it relate to anything other than the ego self? It is of interest that in the Islamic enunciation of faith, it begins with the primordial la, as in la ilaha illallah. This is an apophatic call towards the divinity, ensures that religion must be a journey of discovery and not a collection of noble presumptions. We start with the la of unknowing towards the brilliance of the prophetic manifestation. And just as the Shahada begins with the negation, it ends with the positive assumption of the Prophet ﷺ. And in the Quran it says very clearly that the Prophet is closer to the believers than they are to them own selves. The importance to make and shape our environment and the world is elemental to human beings and draws its strength in what Aristotle calls the mimetic impulse, which towards it draws, naming what Aristotle says is the mimetic feature of humanity is we are imitating what we see in nature. The creation of human beings is nothing more oftentimes than copying what is already there. However, pure imitation is not enough. To copy becomes facile oftentimes and deadens the creativity of a human being. It is very famously, as in the Dr. Frankenstein image of his creation, he creates a human being in his own image. The doctor, however, becomes disgusted, very famously in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein is disgusted by the thing that he makes, the thing which is a copy of many great things, but ultimately is a parody of human life. This is how Frankenstein is described. His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of lustrous black and flowing. His teeth were of pearly whiteness, but these luxuries only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. So what Frankenstein does is collect all of these parts of human bodies, he puts them together to think that he will create a wondrous thing. Man is made in the image of God, and he is made noble, but man made in his own image is the inversion of nature. In trying to replicate himself, he produces a lugubrious parody of human life. In the desire to master biological living, he becomes, as the story progresses, the novel progresses, subject to its worst potentials. Mary Shelley's novel continues to haunt the spectre of modern life, not least for the lessons which it teaches us about what it means to be a human being. And specifically today, as a making human being, homophobia, we create, but the world in which we live in today also creates the possibilities to annihilate ourselves, just as Mary Shelley presents 150 years ago. This is of interest primarily because a lot of Western philosophy in the 20th century is trying to deal with this paradox of how do we live in a world which can almost kill us. This is a huge question. Think about, after water and oxygen, the third most consumed substance in the world is concrete. And concrete, as you know, doesn't go anywhere. It sticks around for thousands of years. Liberal estimates to 25,000 years, it will just be there. And every year, enough concrete is poured over the earth to cover all of the British Isles in just 1 year. It's a substance which creates the third largest amount of CO gases, and it's everywhere in this room. Can't get away from it. So it's a paradox. We live, and what and how we live also is a thing which poisons us. This paradox is not taken for granted. And take, for example, Martin Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, the great philosophical masterpiece of the 20th century. And he says about the inability to live authentically in the modern world, Einlichkeit, he calls it, that people find it increasingly difficult to live in a way in which our ancestors found it very simple and easy to live. Think about, for example, I would highly recommend Walter Benjamin's prophetic essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Walter Benjamin, which avers how the rise of modern printing technologies recreates images and in so doing increasingly distances us from the meaning of art itself, foregoing to its facility to the facile to the lie to the fake to the kitsch. The idea that if you have 1 million reproductions of the same image, how authentic can you relate to that image? If it's everywhere, then does it have meaning, right? Everything is everywhere that you wish. It's like, I was listening to a comedian the other day who said, it's so interesting in just one generation how our relationship to photos has changed. When your grandmother would show you photos, she would get out the family album and said, look, son, this is my wedding day. Look, son, this is when we first moved into the house. Oh, look, this is when your grandmother lived with us, right? And now imagine Gen Z showing pictures to their grandchildren. Look, son, these are some shoes that I was going to buy 45 years ago. Oh, look, this is my breakfast I had at some really interesting. This is the waffles that I had 45 years ago. Yeah, there's 15 pictures of them, but they were really nice. Yeah, that's what Walter Benjamin is kind of arguing. It's a parody, but the idea of how do you live and engage with the world authentically. Education in the broadest sense is both artifice and mimetic. It is the invention of the primary sort which humans create, and it is also imitative in that it is transmitted. It is a way through which humans become humane, the means through which we reconcile the métier of life and find repose in life. In this sense, the naturalness of education is evident by its essential appearance in the world. This is something we often are blinded to, since the manner of its construction. Because education is everywhere, we often don't think how natural it is. But I would perhaps point towards a different way of thinking about this, about education and the way of nature, or the educational naturalism that it imbues. It's interesting, the last 50 years or so, there's been such a huge amount of critique, especially from the academic world, on the nature, foundation, the structure of education, and Professor Davids would have a greater thing to say about it than that. Talking about naturalism, we have cats in the building. But 3 books I would perhaps point you towards, which kind of help to look at the lineage of critique of modern education coming from Western academia. The first one would be from the late 1990s, would be Pierre Bourdieu's State Nobility, where he talks about how education essentially reproduces its own inequalities. There are certain kinds of people who get in, just like in this university right now, there are certain kinds of people who get into the best university. Why is that? Is that a certain class of people get into a certain class of university? And then Patrick Berger's brilliant essay about McDonaldization of society, and his chapter on education still is highly regarded, if not kind of tongue-in-cheek analysis of how the fast food industry, or the principles of the fast food industry, such as mechanization, accountability, replication, are also in schools today. So schools become McDonaldized, he says. And then the last book I'd recommend to kind of gain an appreciation of this is David Baker's brilliant work from 10 years ago called The School Society. A fantastic work talking about how the education system is not what it was. It's become what he calls in his sociological nomenclature a primary institution. Meaning that if you don't do well in school, it's as if you didn't achieve your humanity. So if someone drops out of high school, they're not fully human. As if going to school and passing tests is a measure of your humanity somehow. It's an astonishing development. And he says, don't take that for granted. Don't think that that's a natural way. It's literally in the last 65 years that that's happened. That's why he calls it a primary institution. The society becomes schooled, and that we envision as well as we understand human potential through credentials. And that is highly problematic. So if you don't do well, then you haven't done well in life somehow. But it's a failure of society. It's not a failure of students that happens. So if we're thinking, if education is amongst the most natural things that we do, then the problems of environmental collapse seem of existential primacy. Namely, how we live may cause us to peril. It's as if it's a Chinese proverb which says to cut the feet to fit the shoe. So you're destroying yourself in order to live. But if education is natural, then the corollary is what is nature? This is not something easily answered, especially if we continue to stay with the sensibility of modern education, since it is a troubled relationship with the nature of nature. This may sound prosaic, but trying to define and understand nature and our connectivity to it, it's not an easy thing at all to do. If you'd like to learn more about this, and if you haven't come across this work already, but Louis Dupuis' brilliant work, A Passage to Modernity, is a brilliant book that tries to understand how a Western conception of nature basically took over the world. And it's a fantastic work. So he says specifically the Greek idea of where we get the word physics from, but physis in Greek, Phys, was the word that they used for growth and spontaneity. And it was the animative aspect of growth that allows things to rise and to be created. However, with the rise, for example, of modern philosophy in the 17th century, late 16th century, someone, René Descartes, very famously, and his idea of the mechanization of biological life kind of inverts this old pre-modern conception of nature being everywhere and in everything and through everything. So René Descartes, very famously in the Philosophical Meditations, speaks about, that idea of cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, right? It's the kind of mantra of modern philosophy that perception is the means by which reality is apprehended. And for that you need consciousness. But what about things that don't have consciousness? It's one of the dark aspects of modern philosophy is that he understood, and it became a very popular belief, that non-human life is really not sentient in the same way that we are sentient. So he has, for example, so here's Mr. Descartes. His actual René means the revived, it means Mujaddid, that's my name. So, but I don't hold these beliefs, I promise you. Okay, so this is the syllogism of his thinking. Animals are machines, automata. They are métier, machine, which is they are programmed by God to do the things that they're supposed to do. That's what he means by that. They do not think, because thinking requires... To think you need what? They have brain. They have brain because they have neurological impulse, but they don't have something in the brain which we have, which is... I love it. Like, rah. Yeah, exactly. Consciousness, aql, right? The ability to make ikhtilaf, they don't have that. They have no language, they have no self-consciousness, and they have, therefore, animals are totally without feeling. So, this is how oftentimes ideas can impugn and can affect society. So he was known in the Latin Quarter of Paris, where he would live and study and teach, to kick animals, like the little cat, for example, to prove that no, they don't have feelings, because they don't have consciousness in the same way that we do. So you can do that. The idea of treating nature in this way, because we are separate from nature. And this is an incredibly important aspect in our development of the modern world, and how we are not actually in nature, we are separate from it. Turning then to the Islamic mind, if we can speak of it in such terms, the Quranic language speaks of the natural order in very, very different ways. So here, for example, very famous, the seven heavens, the earth, and whatever is between them all glorify him. This is an interesting aspect of the nature of nature. There's a very famous hadith, it's in Al-Tabarani and the Majmu'. He says, the Prophet ﷺ says, take care of the earth, for she is your mother, No one does good or evil on her except she will speak of it on the Qiyamah, on the day of resurrection. It's fascinating that there is a tradition related to the Isra wal Mi'raj, in which the Prophet is walking with Jibreel, with the archangel, and they see a lady on the side of a pathway. They walk past her, and Jibreel says to the Prophet ﷺ, turn and honor her. And so the Prophet ﷺ turns and gives this person salam. And the Prophet said, who was she? How was she? To his Sahaba. And she said, she was a very beautiful lady, very old, very graceful in the Arabic. And he asked Jibreel, he said, who was that? He said, that's your mother, that was earth. Literally, not as a symbol, but actually allegorized in a person. This is your mother, this is Jibreel said, literally in the Arabic it says the life of what's left of the earth. This is her. So it's literally interacting with Mother Nature, that concept which is in almost all human cultures. And it's always in the feminine. So this is interesting. Just a couple of quotes about how pre-modern thinkers have thought about the relationship of nature, our relationship to nature. This is لَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ عَبْدًا مِمَّا كَانَ, a very famous proposition by Al-Ghazali. There's nothing impossibility more wondrous than that which is. So God, this is a part of the Kalam argument, that God creates perfectly, and a manifestation of that which is will not be more perfect than that which can be. So everything requires a certain adab or etiquette in your interaction with it. Humankind is so this is from Ragib Isfahani, who was a student, of course, of Ghazali. الإنسان هو علم صغير ومختصل إلى علم كبير. It's a very famous proposition in Islamic philosophical thought that you are in the big and the big is in you. The macro and the microcosm are connected. It's like Imam Maulana, he says, Maulana Rumi, that you are a drop in the ocean, all of you. If you think about it, there is something in you that will never perish. It's quite an astonishing thing. Once you come into existence, theologically, you never stop being. It's like what the Hindus call the Atman, or the unperishable thing inside of you. So Rumi says, you are a drop, just one tiny drop in the ocean, but the whole ocean is also in you. This is how a pre-modern cosmology understood itself, how you relate to the world. You're not separate or distinct from it. You are in it, through it. It's like the ancient Taoist understanding of Wu Wei. Wu Wei means effortless action. You don't need to do, it's in you. So stop fighting nature and you'll be happy. But the more you swim against it and you try to deviate from it, you'll be unhappy. So this is a really interesting poem, which was partly translated by the lady in the back, Professor Amna Nawaz. She's very kindly joined us today. This is by Abu Ghani al-Nablusi, who was considered one of the most important theological voices of the 17th century, a brilliant scholar. He writes this poem about the nature of the dog. And we have this impression that the dog and he's like a Hanafi, Levantine scholar. And this poem talks about what you can learn and must learn from a dog. It's not something which God's accident or a pig is a God's accident. No, it has frame and reference, and it has something important to teach us. And so these are some of the points here. It says here, he's a restless hunger, the righteous ones are just so, and as a place of his own, he has nowhere definite to go. Okay, he's wandering, and he is always at his master's table. Akin to the lovers of God, he leaves behind no inheritance. When he dies, it is with independence. That's beautiful. Yeah. Why are we saying this? Because I think it's a very important part of a kind of pre-modern Islamic conception of cosmology. There is Imam Kishani, the great Hanafi scholar, talks about the verse in the Quran that says, amthalukum, that they are communities like you. In the Quran it says, the animals are like communities. So they said, what is this about? How can they be like this? They will have their qiyamah, they have a spirit. And many of them, Kishani, he says that actually they receive revelation. The animals, this is an opinion, they also receive revelation from their own kind. There is actually a hadith, I believe it is from Ibn Majah, in which the Prophet ﷺ is speaking about a prophet of a previous time. And he says, this prophet was living at a time where there was a huge drought, right? Again, environmental dependence. So the Prophet ﷺ said this prophet went out into a midan and they started to pray for the which is also a part of the human story, of praying for rain. You see that in almost all cultures in human history. So he starts praying for rain, he puts his hands up, and then this prophet, he puts his hands down, he said, your prayers have been answered, we can go. And his community said, you didn't make a prayer, you just came here. And so this prophet, he said, I saw an ant, it was raising its consciousness to Allah, and God answered the prayer of the ant, and so the rains will come. So this is a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is relating about another prophet. But that kind of, the sensitivity to the banality of things, the sensitivity towards things that we don't think about, that is what we're trying to think about today. This is a beautiful little poem from William Wordsworth, one of my favorite poets. Why am I putting this in here? Well, it comes from a specific point about the point of when you are constricted in something, it doesn't mean that your liberty is also constricted. What does that mean in relationship to the environment? Why the environment does restrict us, and it's oftentimes restricting us for a specific purpose. So education becomes, in the Adamic manner, a spiritual and aesthetic program of moral refinement, one melded within parallel expressions in creation. In this vision of Islamic learning, education merges as the task of becoming who we are by searching for an ephemeral character in its exalted spiritual origins and diminutive corporality. In Islamic educational writings on this matter, it is worth of note the adoration of ilm or knowledge is often paired with amal. There exists an unsurprising bond between knowledge and action, each blossoming in each other's presence. Curiously, in the Quranic account of the creation of Adam, after the incident of the tree, the first man, Adam, is asked why he did what he did. And what does he do? In Surah Baqarah, he impues himself. When God asks him, he says, I was nafsihi, like he says about my own nafs, I was the one who was at fault, right? What does Iblis do? Iblis is also asked, the ablesa, like the one who has foregone hope. And he says, you made me do it. Very, very different response. It's like the one who's taking responsibility, the one who doesn't take responsibility. It's like the one who says, you made me hit you. You made me do this to you, right? That kind of person takes no moral responsibility for their actions and has no spiritual elevation because of it. Imam Maulana Rumi, speaking about Rumi, we're in the context of Anatolia, he says both Adam and Iblis are correct. Both of them are correct in the Mathnavi, he says. Why? Because, La khawfun alayhim, in the Quran it says that the people of Sulha, the people of spiritual highness, have no fear. Adam answered truthfully, right? It was his fault. And Iblis is right because there's no power apart from what God commands. So he can't surprise God. God knew this would happen. Rumi says why Adam has a possibility of returning back to the garden is because he had adab. He had etiquette. Iblis doesn't have etiquette, even if he's right. That's like, I'm right, but you're spiritually and morally repugnant. It's like, I'm an academic, look at me, I'm sitting over here, standing over here, but I'm a horrible person. What does it matter? In the Islamic conception of things, your knowledge is embodied in you, right? So you can't be a rapist and a brilliant theologian. It doesn't work like that, right? Unfortunately, if you look at sexual harassment cases on North American universities, the highest number of cases of sexual improprieties between a professor and a student happen in philosophy faculties, unfortunately. It's the only place in the university left where they speak about virtue, ethics, moral standing. And unfortunately, I'm not saying everywhere, but in the States at least, that's where the highest number of improprieties occur. From an Islamic conception of learning and knowledge and action, you don't have the knowledge which your knowledge is just in your hand. It hasn't entered you in any meaningful way. I think that's one of the great reasons and the blessings of being here together with you all, is that we're able to kind of really think about these things, because the way of our understanding of knowledge isn't just a profession, something that we put to bed at night, but it's something that lives with us. And I think that's part of the problem in the environmental miasma of today, is that it's still seen as something that is out there, it's not within us. Just like we think, my knowledge and my credentials are great, my profession is outside of myself, what I do on the weekend and all the rest of it is my own business. But this classical conception of learning, really you are in you. It's like the old Stoic Roman understanding that the man is in him, meaning that everything you are and you need to be is in you. It's like the Western understanding the artis liberalum, the early universities called it the arts of liberality because it's there to make you free. It's there to open your mind from the fetters of wrong thinking. In the Islamic conception, an educated person, man or woman, especially in the late medieval period, is called rajul. Rajul means what? Yeah, it means man or means person. From rijal, the one who's able to stand on his feet, right? Because that means you don't need the artifice, you don't need the computer, you don't need your laptop, you don't need anything. Who you are, what you are is there. That is the purpose of education, is essentially that you begin to stand on your feet, not to get a job and get a mortgage. That's not what we're talking about. It's to morally, intellectually find freedom to be who you are and to find who you are. That kind of language is often dispelled from the modern academy, unfortunately, because we don't think of learning in that way. We think of learning as essentially the means by which you can get a job and which you can, because everyone is so worried about your risk, about your food and your water. And you have a whole generation of young people who think that, oh, okay, I'm coming to Boğaziçi. Think about here at this campus you're sitting in, the YKS exam. 3 million students approximately take the exam every year. 3 million students, right? The population of London is around 6.5 million. 3 million people, the acceptance rates at this university is like 99.1% rejection. And so it's like Hunger Games. It's like, every man and woman for himself, right? Because if you don't get into the university, you won't be able to feed yourself, or this idea, it's inbuilt into the system of learning, because competition will lead to the greatest outcome. Well, actually, then what happens? Here we are 2 generations in of thinking about education in this way. Think about the anxiety rates, think about suicide. I used to teach at Cambridge University, and you won't find more anxious and less prepared people to enter the world. Because getting into those universities is wonderful, but it also breaks them as well. Don't think that these things don't come at a cost. They come at a huge cost to the internal life of people. And so the way we think about education today is completely different from how previous generations thought about it. It's about you become elevated. The more you know, the more you can become, right? So the more that you can understand and have sensitivity to the world. In this way of thinking about learning, and I'm parodying it, of course it's not all like this, but what it does is essentially make individuals more individual, as opposed to the individual becoming more social, so that you can learn how to live with people. You can have a family, you can have a community, you can have sohbah, you can really imitate what paradise essentially looks like. In our conception of paradise, in the Islamic conception, it's a garden where people sit together and talk, have tea. It's not in the kind of Judeo-Christian conception, which is it's a city of God, right? St. Augustine says. For the Islamic milieu, it's you came from a garden. This world is a garden, essentially, and you'll go back to a garden. And what is garden? From paradise, from the Farsi, it means a walled place. Has dimension, it's a space of specificity. Okay, in any case, this is a beautiful little verse here. I put it in because William Wordsworth is talking about how a sonnet or a specific meter of poetry, it restricts you in how many words you're allowed to use, right? In a maqam, for example, or in a meter or any kind of poetry, it always restricts you. But look what he says. In sundry moods 'twas pastime to be found, within the sonnet's scanty plots of ground. Scanty plot essentially meaning you can't really do much with those words, but when you interact with that, when you understand and act within your limitations, you can do great things. And then he says, for who have felt the weight of too much liberty, too much freedom is a weight on the human self as well. Why have we called this the aporia of anxiety. This is what we want to get to. This is a hadith about zuhud, hada. This is which is interesting. We'll read it together. Aestheticism or zuhud is not simply a matter of you denying yourself what is lawful, of you spurning wealth. Asceticism is your having more faith in what is in the hand of God than what is in your hand, in your own hand. And asceticism is you're desiring more a reward for your enduring affliction than an end to it. Why we're talking about this primarily is because it's an idea of how do you relate to the world, how the higher spiritual aspects of what the Prophet is speaking about here is not, it's kind of an intermission towards the kind of normative economic conception that we are consumers and that there are limited resources, infinite wants, right? We all know this. But that is like the lawamic conception. It's like the lowest conception of what a human being can be. You're basically an animal and you will just constantly be an animal until you die. But here, what the Prophet ﷺ is showing in a different, emergent way is that what we are can be more than that. And what we are more when we are enlivening what's inside right there. Once you do that, you can relate to the world in a very interesting way. So zuhud, and this is what the early communities, I would say in the first 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ passes, this word of zuhud is used a lot. And so in this description, it's about what's happening inside of the heart as opposed to you letting go of things, right? To become environmentally friendly doesn't necessarily mean to let go of the environment. It means having a reevaluation of what's happening inside of us. And that is incredibly difficult. It's easy to recycle. It's easy to not buy a certain product or something which is not great for the environment. It's much, much harder to reevaluate your internal constitution and how you relate to things. That is the difficult part. So this is a very famous philosopher, Al-Kindi, one of the earliest philosophers in the Islamic world, a Platonist, and he wrote a book about the dispelling of sorrows. Why are we talking about this? Well, I want to think about how an emotional state such as anxiety and the environment, which we all kind of grow up thinking about, oh, the world is coming to an end and it's very problematic, we need to do something. How pre-modern people thought about it. Before we get to this quote, it's interesting, I would recommend Al-Qushayri, who was a brilliant 13th century spiritual master. He wrote the Risala al-Qushayriya, which is a very important, like every part of that book has a different chapter. Each chapter looks at a different ailment in the human psyche. And it's very short chapters. So the Risala has a chapter on this idea of huzn, of anxiety. And he mentions that it is when anxiety about things of this world does not prevail over you despite your dire need of them, and when your reliance upon God prevails in you despite your dependence on such things. It's interesting. Anxiety is related to this idea of fear, of khawf. And khawf is not necessarily a bad thing. So if you think about in the Old Testament, there is the book of Proverbs attributed to the King Prophet Solomon. The first proverb says that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So fear is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when it's overpowering your ability to act, then it becomes crippling, right? But fear in itself is a necessary thing. Fear is an instinctive thing. You teach your children to be fearful about running over a step or going near fire. But this idea of khawf, especially when it overturns you, is incredibly problematic. So fear is both a necessary and diminutive aspect, a function of the human being. Necessarily, since without it, the ego is pulled away from our center, from the divine command, to other phantoms as a source of privilege in life. We are homo faber, as I mentioned earlier, the animal who makes, and we do this with no small deftness. I would recommend, for example, looking at the exceptional work of Professor George Steiner, the English professor at Cambridge who died 10 years ago now, and his Macy lectures from 1974. A brilliant series called Longing for the Absolute, where he argues that when the desire to make the world in our image goes wrong, so the rise in the 20th century of ideologies such as Marxism, Stalinism, Nazism, communism, he says they are all actually a much larger problem in the human psyche about wanting to be fulfilled. And so the making human being or the making person is making ways of filling the void in us, which is a really interesting, and Steiner was not like a religious person in terms of like formalized religion, but it is fascinating how this relates to this idea of sorrow and anxiety and too much sadness leading to anxiety, which is the inability to act. And if you think about Hamlet, if you think about Oblomov, if you think about the great characters in human history, think about Dostoevsky's The Great Fall, brilliant novel. Albert Camus, the French philosopher's novel called The Fall. It's about characters who are overwhelmed with anxiety and they don't know how to act. The anxiousness destroys them. And this is part of the internal contradiction. I call it the aporia of anxiety, is because anxiety creates its own diminishing aspect. More anxiety, less ability to act. We don't know how to act. How do you fix the environment? Oh, you don't know, but there's so many problems. How do you actually deal with it? Right? Because there are so many layers to it. It's like its own cosmology. How does anyone know how it even works? So this is a small quote that I just wanted to add to the lecture, was by Al-Kindi, who lived, as you see here, in the 9th century. And this is one of the remedies he speaks about. We should remember, when anything has been lost or missed, what has remained for us, for our sensory and rational possessions, and distract ourselves from the former by remembering and counting them. For there is solace from disaster in remembering what remains. And he's referring also back to the Adamic story, that Adam remembers what he has as opposed to dwelling on what he lost. He lost the garden, but he gained the favor of God. Iblis lost the garden and lost the favor of God, right? So remembering your blessings is an incredibly important part of that. So why anxiety have I chosen this word for the keynote? Is because it's kind of the preponderant theme of modern society, it seems like. Here are just a few works that I would recommend looking at. First one is probably the most brilliant memoir of the 20th century by Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer. He's known for many great works, but this, The World of Yesterday, speaks about Europe just before the First World War. And he speaks about, as a young man growing up in Vienna, amongst the Habsburg Empire, the Ottomans are still around, the British Empire is there, and how much certainty he grew up in as a young person. It's a brilliant book. It's the same environment that Freud and Einstein and all of these really fascinating early 20th century figures are. He also talks about the contradictions of modern European society, how Vienna is this incredible jewel in the crown of Europe, but it's also under the surface, it has deep-rooted problems. But he talks about how the First World War completely unstabilized society, and this thing about, how we live today, we'll always live like this. Stefan Zweig is writing at the same time as another brilliant German writing author called Thomas Mann. He wrote the Zauberberge, which is The Magic Mountain, considered probably the most widely quoted novel of the 20th century. The Magic Mountain, what's the Magic Mountain about? It's about people who have come together in Switzerland, and it's based on a retreat center, and everyone has these existential problems about how to live in the world. And the novel ends, spoiler, with the coming of a great war. But it's a phenomenal account of a world in which religion has ceased to be important, a world in which science is kind of taking over, where the possibility of mass destruction of human beings is happening. The second one in the middle is anyone come across this book before? Liquid Modernity? Professor, yes. Some of Bauman's great work from the 20th century. It's given as introduction to modern sociology. It's a brilliant work about how modern society displaces traditional forms of family, capital, environment, education. Things are constantly shifting and moving. And then if you guys, anyone have children here? Who has children? Put your hands up. Okay. Oh, we have a younger crowd. Not so many people have children. Okay. Even if you don't have children, this is a fascinating book, The Anxious Generation. New York Times bestseller for, I think, 36 weeks or something. What does he talk about? He's talking about this generation that is now around, basically our students here around 20 years old, brought up on technology, exposed to a lot on the internet, have more access to information, knowledge than any other generation in human history at the tap of their fingers. Why are they so anxious? Why is the mental health epidemic happen? It's a new pandemic. And he talks about it. He talks about the relationship between young people, technology, fulfillment, education, happiness. What we saw is what I termed the big problem fallacy. This is just a definition I came up with, that due to this is obviously Sisyphus from the Greek tragedy, the man who puts up the stone, right? You've heard of this, yeah? Due to its perceived complexity and magnitude, the problem leads to the possibility of an active, authentic, and a gentle response. We are left confused by its intricacies, lugubrious in the wake of its scope, and listless in the possibilities of acting. And then we showed children in your schools at 8 years old, the world is coming to an end, climate is going up, and now here's this huge problem that you have to basically fix. It's like the modern economy. The modern economy is collapsing, try to fix it. It's too much to put on the shoulders of any person, and especially for young people. So, because I think the way that we think about big environmental problems is that how previous people didn't think, is that you have a possibility of attaching the problem to a much bigger arc of creation, right? Whereas in the modern concept, it's, well, what do the policies say? What does the economic outlook look like? How do we countervail these issues and these problems? Whereas in the sacred traditions of human history, the picture is even bigger than the universe and stars dying. That's a big thing, but the picture is vastly bigger than that. It's about the very nature of existence. So about these problems that are coming about, there's a really interesting book that I point you towards, Education's End, Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. It was very controversial when it came out, but Professor Kroman is a respected scholar, I think, from English literature, and he talks about what happens when you give up the pursuit of ethics, morality, and human pursuit for undergraduates, for young people. What happens? Where do they get it from? Because they will seek it. Okay, so this is the education. The paintings here are from Claude Monet and Manet, and this is specifically done because of the need in portraiture in Western art in the last 150 years is to reclaim an understanding of nature, and the Impressionists did it in a very specific way to kind of give you an impression of nature which people weren't getting, as cities arose in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So this is the very famous hadith about the people who travel for knowledge, is that the all of existence comes and is partaking in your journey with you. It's a phenomenal thing. I've never seen it in any other human tradition, that this idea that knowledge, it literally is like the Noah's Ark of existence, and everyone is ushering you through it. It's a beautiful poetic conception of understanding knowledge. Okay, this is why we're here. We're here because we are irrelevant. This picture, this book shows it, why we are irrelevant. I'm sure, Professor, you've come across this, but this is a book that came out, I believe, in 2018 or 19. Oxford Handbook they have a series of handbooks that they make on lots of different topics. This is the history of education. What picture do you think what is that portrait depicting?
Classical Islamics.
A classical, a little madrasa, right? A small madrasa, kutab. It's a painting by Ludwig Deutsch, a really beautiful painting in the madrasa, and he lived a long time in the Muslim world. Now, why I'm showing you that is because this book is the history of education, right? Wonderful. We love education. How many chapters do you think are in this book about Islam?
None. One.
You got to choose. There's no chapter on Islam in this whole book. This book is almost 700 pages, and it moves from medieval Christian scholasticism to early Bushido Japan. It completely misses the huge chunk in the middle. That's why we're not relevant.
But then the portrait wasn't relevant.
That's a great point, sir. Because it's enough to put it on the cover, but not important enough to put in the book. I'm just being rhetorical here. I'm not sure why they didn't do it. But it's glaringly evident that you would have, which is a very substantial, this book ends up in all universities, certainly in the West. And this is why you're here, I guess, is to kind of think about maybe the voices that you have, the writing that you want to present to the world. It has an incredible amount of relevance and importance to this collective community of thinkers. Don't think that your work is irrelevant just because it's perhaps in a niche of things. It's incredibly important. This is just a quote that I always love to put in a presentation, because what Professor William Graham is talking about here from Harvard is Islam is essentially, it's like a cosmopolitan unity, he calls it. It's a beautiful conception that you don't really see in other religious traditions. And why it's important is because there is something recognizable, astonishingly recognizable across all these regional divisions. And how we're going to pursue that is, this is another really interesting person. Franz Rosenthal was arguably the most important Orientalist of the 20th century, later 20th century. And he wrote a book in which it's called Knowledge Triumphant. I would highly recommend you look at it. And in that book he says there's no other faith community or community in the world that has placed so much emphasis on knowledge, because knowledge is like the lifeblood of this tradition, he says. And he was a polymath. He was an incredible... And if you read Knowledge Triumphant by Franz Rosenthal, you'll see why I say that. Okay, so coming back to the Prophet. Adabani Rabbi wahsani tahdibi. Astonishing, he educated me and perfected my adab. It's incredible if you think about, at the apex of the religious tradition, ilm, amal and adab, right? Sorry, no. It's in the hadith with Jibreel, the Prophet is asked, what is Islam, what is Iman, and then what is Ihsan, right? So Ihsan from Husn, meaning beautiful. What is beauty, right? So the idea of what is beautified excellence, what does it look like? Again, it's a very unique position in religious discourse, because beauty is placed right at the top. It's not just excellent. It's not like in the Greek idea of arete or paida. Ihsan is a very different conception of how every single aspect of your life can be lived with beautified brilliance. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Because he says, the Prophet ﷺ says, how do you know that? So he's asked, he says, you worship as if God is seeing you, right? So he used the example of the formally how the divine can know you. And you think about, fast forward to the end of history, the beatific vision, according to the Christian tradition, the Jewish as well as the Islamic, the highest pleasure of the hereafter is not in the food, not in the parrot. It's what? It's the seeing. And he related it in this world to act as if he's seeing you now, right? Because you will see him then, but he's seeing you now. It's an incredible aspect of the double projection of vision. Okay. This is from Al-Qushayri we mentioned previously. So I just want to mention something about prophetic pedagogy, because obviously it's we're thinking about the Islamic tradition and education, and this is our specialisms. Ilm, amal and adab, and ihsan, husn and rahma are also parts of the triad of our philosophical dwellings of these concepts. It's a very important aspect of it. I just want also to mention, just like in the Oxford Handbook, which leads any Islamic voice, this is a database construct. 85,000. Now it's around almost 90,000 people. It's a database created by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the West Coast in America, arguably the most prestigious science university in the world. So they rank people according to their influence. This is an influence index. So everyone's on there. What's so fascinating is they put the Prophet Muhammad right at the top, and by no small margin. It's really interesting how they measure influence. Now, what's so fascinating is that influence doesn't really have a correspondence in the academic literature, for example, in terms of, like we just mentioned, prophetic pedagogy. What does it mean? We know more about the Prophet Muhammad than basically anyone from pre-modern history. There's more accounts of his life than it's a great book about that, but I think Carl Ernst makes that point. Great scholar who says, we know more about Muhammad than anyone in pre-modern history. And there's a lot about education embedded in that, but we don't really kind of explore that academically, unfortunately. It's all kind of left to different realms. Ideas of ihsan or beautified excellence, what does it look like? Here is an example for Ibn Jama'ah. Ibn Jama'ah from Brian Cook. Brian Cook is an Arabic Orientalist. He's an Orientalist living in America, brilliant scholar. He did the editions of Ibn Jama'ah, Cook says, Ibn Jama'ah, the man where this quote is from, he wrote the first student-centered pedagogy manual in human history. Ibn Jama'ah is buried in Cairo next to Imam Shafi, the great jurist. And he says why the early community did what they did when you don't have to do it. For example, Imam Malik, the great jurist from Medina, he's talking about how he would prepare himself when going and giving dars or giving hadith in the Prophet's mosque. You don't have to put perfume, you don't have to bathe, you don't have to change your clothes, you don't have to sit on a raise, you don't have to burn aloes wood. You know how expensive aloes wood is? It's one of the most, apart from ambergris, one of the most expensive perfumes in the world. Why do they do that? You don't have to. But beautified excellence looks like that. It's not because it's like Zweck rational, as Weber would call it. It's not doing something in order to immediately to get to the end of something, but to dwell in the thing. It's like John Keats, the great British poet. He was asked, how do you work a poem out, by one of his young acolytes, right? Poetry, we love poetry. How do you work it out? And he said, a poem doesn't need working out. You don't go to swim in order to immediately get to the shore, but to dwell in the sensation of water, right? That's what ihsan is like, is to do the thing because it's beautiful to do. You get up in the morning, you make your coffee, everything is sacralized because everything is ritualized. And here, this is one of the probably the most influential medieval muhaddith or scholar of hadith from the medieval world. Khatib al-Baghdadi was known as the Khatib of Baghdad. This is a manual in the Jami' al-Akhlaq about how does a student acquire etiquette when going about the sacred task of learning, whether they're learning anything, not just religious sciences, not just the naqliya, but the aqliya as well. How do you acquire knowledge? And it's an astonishing list. All of these are chapters in the book of the Jama'. Here is again Ibn Jama'a from the Tadhkirat, again one of these early but arguably, unparalleled projections of student pedagogy. I've been teaching history of education this semester at this university, and we read Plato and Quintilian and Aristotle, the Stoics, but no one is talking about this kind of sensitivity in the classroom. How do you deal with the shy student? How does a student deal with a teacher? How do you make them feel? Literally, he has a whole chapter on why the teacher needs to stand outside welcoming students in, right? And then you can he says, you can get an apprehension of how they're feeling today. You don't see that in the ancient world. This is from medieval Sarajevo in today's Bosnia-Herzegovina. I wanted to give just 2 examples before we finish of how most people in the Muslim world, because we're thinking about this tradition of Islam, never walked inside a madrasa ever. If you think about it, we think that education means the maktab or the madrasa. Most people never did. Most people joined a fatua or a guild of some sort. What were they being taught in guilds? This is a book that I'm working on right now, is to think about guild education and how oftentimes the aesthetic and the procedural are placed together. This is from a tanner's guild. They would make leather products. And so this is on the Fatua Name, which is the front cover of the guild, to tell you what you're doing here. And this is what they came up with. It's an astonishing account of the sensitivity that people placed in. And this is, what I'll show you next, you think it's like from science fiction. This is a Fatua Name from the farmers of Sarajevo in 16th century Sarajevo, right? What are they saying? They're saying if you want to join our community of farmers, there are certain restrictions. There are certain procedures. One of them is learning the adab, or the etiquettes of treating the animal. They have songs, it says here, for the animals. When you're going with them, don't burden them with too much, right? Don't hit them. Every seed that you plant with a bismillah, it says it all here. It's not something which is out of sight and mind, but it shows if you're able to take control of every aspect of the things that are in your presence, how do we reappropriate ecological or environmental sensibility? That's what comes back to the question of how do you engage with the environment? You make everything meaningful. Oh, and we're finished. Thank you. Thank you ever so much. I appreciate it. Wonderful.